Well, Donald Trump got some terrible news yesterday, which is actually part of a larger trend. Nikki Haley continues to earn a substantial portion of the Republican primary vote, even though she dropped out more than 2 months ago. And it's so bad that even the Fox Propaganda Network and Newsmax are taking note that Donald Trump is much weaker than he would have you believe. But before we unpack all of that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and alert bell. I'd greatly appreciate it. And for your viewing pleasure, I have a guest. I have a co-pilot here, the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Luke Beasley of The Luke Beasley Show. What's up, Luke?
Josiah, it is so great to be with you, and I can't say I hated that introduction.
No, nor should you, especially when not only I recognize you as the man, the myth, the legend, but also that Donald Trump has some terrible news. And with that in mind, let's play some clips, again, of Newsmax and the Fox Propaganda Network having to report a terrible trend for Donald Trump.
Well, former President Trump capturing Indiana's Republican nomination Tuesday. Voters in the Hoosier state going to the polls to cast their ballots in the state's presidential and some state primaries. Trump secured 58 GOP delegates. Nikki Haley won nearly 22% of the vote, despite dropping out in March.
I think the Nikki Haley factor is real. You look at it, Indiana's a small state. By the way, it's Mike Pence's home state. It's a red state. Went for Trump in 2016, went for Trump in 2020. 11 electoral votes, so not a huge number there. But still, if he's missing out on 100,000 votes in a state like that, and then 155,000 in Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, you can't tell me that he doesn't have a problem with Nikki Haley voters.
But look, he has to win Nikki Haley voters. And they're not necessarily Nikki Haley loyalists to her specifically. Some of them are. But it's, depending on what state you're looking at, maybe 1/5 of Republican voters say they're not comfortable with Trump. They want it to be someone else. They're still voting for her sort of out of protest, even though she's been out of the race for the better part of, 2 months at this point. Those people are going to be essential to a Trump victory coalition.
These voters, 20%.
That's wild.
The primary is over. Yeah. Haley is no longer a candidate. And people are going through the trouble of showing up to vote against Donald Trump. That is a problem for him.
So, Luke, listen, there was a lot there that we need to talk about, but I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about yesterday's Tuesday Republican primary results in Maryland, in Nebraska, in West Virginia. Kind of, continue this devastating trend for Trump, Nikki Haley earned 20% of the Republican primary vote in Maryland, 9.4% in West Virginia, of all places, which is a heavy Trump state, not just a heavy Republican state, but heavily Trump loyal. I mean, these are devastating statistics.
And just to contextualize it for the audience, I'm sure they've been keeping up with this, but as a reminder, it's not that Nikki Haley's running against Trump and this would be being trounced, of course, but instead she's out of the race. There's no chance she can be the nominee. They're voting for someone who's dropped out already. And that means they're going actively, affirmatively to show their support. Yes, sort of for Nikki Haley, but again, she's not really a candidate anymore. So instead, it's more about showing their opposition to Donald Trump. And we've seen in state after state, many of them, 1 out of 5 Republican primary voters are coming out to say, I know that she has no chance. I just want Trump to know I'm voting against him. And then when you hear anecdotally and in some of these polls, the exit polling on why Nikki Haley voters are voting the way that they are, some of them are saying there's no chance in the general I'm voting for Trump. And right now I'm in the middle of a pretty emotionally distraught moment trying to process why the polls aren't better for Biden, why so many people still support Trump amid everything. And it's tough. And I've been having conversations with people recently. It's hard to get your head around. But if there's a hopeful element of this current moment as it pertains to polling, it's that maybe enough of the Republican Party even is so fed up with Trump that they may abandon him come November.
Yeah, so to your point, I think it is fair to say that, listen, if Nikki Haley were still in the race, these would not be numbers to write home about, right, to be sure. But what makes them so stark is, as you say, she's not a viable candidate. She dropped out of the race. She suspended her campaign more than 2 months ago. Effectively, Donald Trump is running unopposed. And the fact that he actually isn't, if you look at the polling results, the fact that reliably between a 6th and a 5th, occasionally it's creeping up towards a 4th, depending on the state, that he's getting that sort of protest, that sort of opposition from the Republican base is staggering, especially when, since you mentioned President Biden, when President Biden was facing opposition from Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, you may recall I know I do, because I have nightmares about it, seeing the mainstream media overemphasize the threat that Biden's Democratic challengers posed. Oh, Biden stumbles through, the Democratic primary. He struggles, he slogs his way through the Democratic primary, while they also very often pretended that Donald Trump had this in the bag and there was no meaningful opposition to him. In many ways, in most ways, Donald Trump faced more opposition within his primary than President Biden faced in his, even if you count the uncommitted campaign against him, which I've talked about on my channel. I recognize the civic value of people telling the president, listen, I am willing to vote for you, but I expect a certain policy concession, this time on Gaza and Israel, before I give you the vote. That makes sense because, again, they're trying to pressure Biden into making a different policy choice. Here, the fact that Republicans are lacing up their boots and going out to vote for somebody who is not in the race anymore just to protest Trump, that just goes to show that Donald Trump really has issues even within the GOP, even though we often think of the GOP as very much a cult. That's the word I use all the time. So it's fascinating to kind of contextualize that. Let me ask you that then. How do you reconcile these numbers with the idea, as we've discussed before, that there is a very virulent strain of cultishness within the GOP? Is the GOP, I guess, more open to dissent than perhaps we suspected?
I think it's more about distinguishing between the, what you call, I guess, regular Republicans and the hardcore MAGA Republicans, because we've always known it's not that it's the whole Republican Party that gives Trump his strength. It's that enough of the Republican Party causes it to where the rest of the Republican Party at least feels like it has to follow, which they don't have to follow, but they choose to all too often because MAGA is powerful and influential enough. And that hardcore MAGA portion is very cultish, but clearly other parts of it aren't. My only hope is that more Republicans won't be like Bill Barr, for example, and recognize the threat that Trump poses to democracy, say he's unfit to be president, and then endorse him because, God forbid, Biden builds a few more bridges and roads. And so it's all going to come down to, do they put their money where their mouth is? Because you'll hear these testimonials from Nikki Haley supporters and other more moderate Republicans from within the GOP who acknowledge just how unconstitutional, anti-democratic Trump acted, just how deranged he is and how he shouldn't be anywhere close to the Oval Office. But sometimes the association and loyalty to the party will convince people to look past that threat that Trump poses, like Bill Barr's doing, which is just shameful and horrifying given what he said about Trump. But we're just hoping that people do get away from that cultish core of the party, being the hardcore MAGA part, and see the light, Josiah.
100%. And it's also interesting, too, just speaking very candidly, because it represents an opportunity and a challenge for President Biden here. Because, so Nikki Haley, during the Republican primary debate, she, like everybody else, said that she would support Donald Trump even if he's a convicted felon, which in and of itself is indefensibly stupid and hypocritical, especially coming from somebody who's supposed to, be a leader in the party of law and order. But I digress. Then, when she made her announcement that she was suspending her campaign, she kind of walked it back and said, listen, I'm not endorsing Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to have to earn my vote and your votes the way he would anybody else. Now, one hopes, as you said, if we're thinking rationally and patriotically, these principled conservatives, if that's indeed what they are, will say that, listen, we got to put country above party. There is a possibility, as you say, though, that they run back to the fold as the election draws near. But President Biden has been making public overtures to try to court Nikki Haley supporters. He released press conferences about this and press statements that, listen, whereas Donald Trump, has repeatedly said, basically, to hell with Nikki Haley supporters. We don't want them in the MAGA movement. President Biden says, listen, there's a place for you here. And, cited examples of where, even if Nikki Haley supporters don't get everything they want in terms of policy, were things that Biden has done that they should be able to get behind. What's interesting, too, to me is to contemplate that this tension right now within, the Democratic bloc, because, again, there is that uncommitted movement on the progressive side of the Democratic bloc, which are threatening to withhold votes from the president if they don't get policy concessions. And again, I just want to be very clear about this. I've defended that right from the very beginning, that you have the right to basically negotiate your vote with the president. I will give you my vote in exchange for policy concessions. But if also you have more conservative, like moderate conservatives who Biden is trying to court as well, it's interesting. It makes you think of like a negotiation where you're both trying to compete for the president's influence, and how are you going to entice him? Because as we've talked about before, the president has been by far the most progressive president in modern times since LBJ, and I think that's to his credit. We obviously want progressive policy. But it's also interesting too, I'm just thinking of the electoral implications, that if Biden feels that he can't get the progressive votes because of the uncommitted movement, maybe he'll start leaning more in to court Nikki Haley votes. Will that be enough? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so as you were talking, I was thinking, I understand your point about the right, and of course you have the right to do what you like in this democratic system, and then the strategy of it you could have different views on. But I also don't know if a part of that strategy is you have to be willing to follow through on the threat, right? Otherwise, Biden, and I can't morally justify anyone following through on the threat of not voting for Biden. So in that sense, I can't really agree with the statement you made, just because to me, and I think most people in our audience hopefully understand, democracy is in the line that yes, pertains to the United States, its stability, and also the globe. And on the particular issues that are being brought up, I think Biden has the better stance than Trump,
clarify?
for sure.
May I clarify that? Because that's a great point. I should have clarified that what I'm hoping is that they bluff Biden, so to speak. Yeah, I want to be clear. I agree that, because even, and I've talked about this before too in debates and conversations that I've had, that even if you're a single issue voter and Gaza is that single issue, based on all available evidence, Trump would be demonstrably worse even on that, right? So there's no rational basis, in my opinion, to either contribute to actively or even to facilitate a Trump presidency, which is exactly what would happen if you don't vote for President Biden. So I just want to make that clear that we're on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was also thinking, while you were talking, this is sort of separate, one of the things that's allowing RFK Jr. to run his candidacy, and a lot of people, Josiah, I was in a social setting and a bunch of people were like, RFK Jr. seems interesting. And my second question to them was, or my first follow-up question was, tell me a detail about him. This is not his last name. And most people don't know much about him, but they see him talking about unity, and everyone's tired of the partisanship. So you understand why people think maybe a third option is good. But what people need to understand is, if we had a more level-headed policy discussion, the vast majority of Americans, even if you don't agree with everything, and maybe you even think he's too old, would be able to understand Biden's a pretty uncontroversial, middle-of-the-road, common sense. Yes, Josiah and I were happy to see some pretty progressive policies, but you poll people on the individual policy that has been implemented, the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, etc., and actually people support these actions. And so the solution to a divided time where Trump's threatening democracy, and let's be honest, that's the core of the current division, is not going to the third option or rejecting both parties in full. Instead, we have to understand, as some Nikki Haley supporters do, the way we meaningfully unify is by unifying around a common set of fundamental principles. And that means we all have to unify around the principle of protecting our Constitution, democracy. And I think we can unite. The vast majority of Americans, I think, want a constitutional democratic republic and want the continuation of the one that we have. And people just need to be informed that those are the stakes, and the way to protect those things is by voting for Biden, not thinking about RFK Jr. or not doing any of the other wild things.
Well, listen, I think you make a great point, except, you say people don't know a lot about RFK Jr. And all I'll tell you is, I actually know, and this has been in the news, do you know RFK Jr.'s favorite dance move? The worm. So anyway, Luke, I
denounced that.
You denounced that, Luke. Listen, I mean, I'm just saying, okay, prolific dancer. No, listen, I completely agree with everything you said as far as, basically we just have to unite behind the framework first. It's like, you may want to take a car, you might want to take a car if you're on a road trip, this exit versus that one. But if you have somebody actively trying to drive it off a cliff, we have to stop that first, and then we can pick an exit, to use a clumsy metaphor there. But listen, I really appreciate it. Luke, where can people find you?
I'm still struggling
the worm
to process the joke.
The worm.
I've processed it, but to further under. Okay, you can find me at Luke Beasley on YouTube, where you won't be hearing any of those dad jokes. Okay.
What are you talking about? Those are epic jokes. The audience is here not for the political analysis. They are here for the comedy. This is rebranding into a comedy channel. Okay, I can't wait to have you back on for stand up.
I'd be honored.